After a state senator played our lawmakers off the stage,
the legend lives on from the Papago on down of the nut house they call the state capitol.
the curtain closed on the 2024 legislative session. We'll look back at the hits and the misses. Did lawmakers cross a legal line with the Secure the Border Act? We talked to an attorney who wants to stop it from reaching the ballot this November. And with the campaign season about to kick off, can Republicans keep control of the legislature? Or will Democrats take the state house and Senate for the first time since the 1960s? Our panel weighs in now on Politics Unplugged.
Good evening, I'm political editor Dennis Welch. This is Politics Unplugged, and the 2024 legislative session finally came to an end as the two sides hammered out a new budget. So what's in it? What's not in it? Here to break it all down for us is longtime reporter Jeremy Duda with Axios. Thanks for being here today. It's a $16.1 billion budget. It's down from the current fiscal year, 17.2, I believe. So you cut some significant spending out of this budget. Top line, what stood out for you? What are some of the top lines from this budget deal that they hammered out last week?
Well, unlike last year, they had a huge surplus. Everyone got some extra money to throw around. Things were a lot different this year. You had, I think, between the current fiscal year and the next one, $1.4 billion. They had $1.4 billion shortfall they had to try to make up. So cuts came from a lot of places. Biggest one, $333 million, I believe, from the last part of a $3-year billion plan that Doug Ducey put into place for find new water sources. Some of that got cut last year. The rest of it, next year's allocation got cut this year. You had most state agencies took some cuts. You had a lot of the road projects, that money that folks were throwing around last year to get votes for the budget. A lot of that's getting cut. Some of it's getting deferred. So the hits came from kind of all over, except public safety, Department of Public Safety, Department of Corrections. These are kind of the most untouchable parts of the budget, even when there's shortfalls. We saw that this year. Universities, some big cuts they're taking there.
Yeah, and I think one of the storylines coming out of this budget, too, is yet again, Governor Katie Hobbs, who campaigned on trying to, rein in ESAs. Once again, she started the State of the State speech off at the beginning of the legislative session this year, saying need to put guardrails on that empowerment scholarship account. Again, that's the account where parents can send their kids to private schools with taxpayer money. Not much got done on that, right?
No, I mean, we had those, some guardrails. You had some changes so folks can't do what's called, I think, a double dipping, where you go to public school and then you use the ESA for stuff over the summer. You had some fingerprinting requirements for, private schools that take ESA money, which, some of the I think there was some grumbling from some Republicans who are big supporters of the program. For the most part, I think most of them could live with that. The Democrats, very unhappy. They've been wanting to, severely curtail this program. For years. It got expanded a couple of years ago to include all students. The problem for the Democrats is they just don't have the votes. Katie Hobbs learned that last year. She put that in her original budget plan as repealing that universal expansion, then quickly realized that she was kind of promising some things, or at least proposing some things that she had no ability to carry out. The votes weren't there. The Republicans view this as untouchable. They've spent, more than a decade trying to get that program where it is, and for the folks who want to rein that in, I think either the Democrats are going to have to take control of the legislature, or they're going to have to put something on the ballot. Yeah,
and that's a discussion for another day. Because the longer this ESA program stays in place, I think the harder it will be to try to rein this in moving forward. Sure. But as far as Democrats are concerned, hearing a lot of grumbling from Democratic leaders down at the legislature that this governor did not fully invite them in to participate with the budget negotiations. What kind of things are you hearing from Democratic leadership?
I think a lot of Democrats felt like they would have more of a seat at the table with the Democratic governor, but in the end, it's still going to be the governor, the speaker, and the Senate president, sitting together, hashing things out, and especially when things get drawn out, to this point, there's just not a lot of time to go back to the caucuses and start negotiating, getting everybody's input. I'm sure there's probably a lot of Republicans who would have liked, rank and file, who would have liked more input into what happened too. But in the end, it was Speaker Toma, President Peterson, and Governor Hobbs, sitting down, hashing things out kind of at the last minute there.
All right, they have sine died, as obviously, anytime Ken Bennett busts out the old guitar, busts out the old gut fiddle, it's sine die is near. But, the governor's still cleaning up some things, still signing some bills, so not officially all the way over, but it is a good time right now to kind of look back at the session as a whole. For me, I look back at this session, it's going to be remembered more so for what it repealed than anything that they did this year and enacted this year, because we had that historic court ruling on abortion, reinstating that 1864 near total abortion ban, and then the legislature moving really fast shortly after that to try to repeal that. How do you think this session gets remembered, and what are some of the other highlights for you?
Probably that one. I think, abortion and illegal immigration, the two issues that are really going to dominate this election, really dominated the legislative session too. At the Arizona Supreme Court's ruling that reinstated that pre-statehood ban on almost all abortions. I think that caught a lot of folks off guard. I think most people probably expected them to say, hey, the 15-week ban is good enough, and obviously, a lot of scrambling there. A few Republicans trying to kind of, I think, undo what they viewed as the damage that would do kind of at the ballot box, and now, there's going to be that ballot measure to enshrine abortion rights in the state constitution, and then Republicans referred this border security illegal immigration measure to the ballot, and these are, the two issues that dominated the legislative session, issues that are going to dominate the election. I think you can see that Democrats are going to be running on abortion, Republicans will be running on the border, and that's going to be kind of an extension of what we saw in the session.
Yeah, and for me, reason why I thought that the what we saw happen with abortion this year was it's almost like a line of demarcation, particularly for Republicans. It changed the way Republicans were talking about abortion in the past. For forever, Republicans have been talking about just getting rid of Roe v. Wade, outlawing abortion, and they knew they could take that kind of stance because they knew Roe v. Wade had been the law of the land. But when that all changed, all of a sudden, they're confronted with this issue of a near total abortion ban, and they move very quickly. At least, a lot of Republicans move very quickly to try to repeal this. That was a massive change, and I think when you start talking about the border initiative, we'll be talking a little bit more about that in the second segment. That's been a Republican issue for a long time, an organizing kind of issue with them. But I do see that the abortion stuff is a little bit more, substantial as far as what happened with that this year, right?
Sure, and I think both parties are counting on these issues to really drive their voters to the polls this year.
Mm-hmm. And when we look at the session as a whole too, is there anything that stands out for you that didn't happen? That there were promises being made going into this. You could look at, was enough done? Did the governor get enough done when it came to water or housing or anything like that?
You saw some movement on both of those issues, but I think for advocates that wanted some big changes, not a lot. Housing. You had some big vetoes on that. Governor Hobbs did sign some legislation on that, on accessory dwelling units or casitas, on little stuff on middle housing.
Casitas is not the answer to the housing situation in Arizona, to be clear.
So you saw some kind of incremental movement, but not some of the some of the bigger changes that'll really move the needle on the issue. Same for housing. I think there's already talk about folks wanting the governor to call a special session. She said she's willing to do that if there's some consensus between Republicans and Democrats, which.
And what's left to what's going to be do you think could be the issue moving ahead, moving ahead next year? What do you think that's setting up for? Is it again going to be housing? Is it going to be water? And I know a lot's going to be determined by how these elections play out, but what's the big issue that still needs to be dealt with that wasn't dealt with this year?
Those are certainly the issues. The issues that we're having now. Those big issues aren't going to change. Some of it will depend on what passes at the ballot in terms of abortion and illegal immigration, and water and housing will still be there. We'll have to see what the budget looks like next year. I think everyone's hoping this downturn is just kind of a temporary thing. But like you said, a lot of it is going to depend on who controls the legislature. You have one-vote majorities for the Republicans. You've had that for the past few years now, and Democrats are viewing this year as a chance to take control for the first time since the 60s.
All right, we're going to have to end it right there. Thanks so much for stopping by here. And still ahead, lawmakers set an immigration enforcement measure to the November ballot, but some activists are crying foul. They'll explain why they think the courts should boot it off the ballot. Next on Politics Unplugged. Welcome back to Politics Unplugged. The legislature sent a measure to the November ballot that would allow local police agencies to enforce immigration laws. But is it constitutional? The activist group Lucha says it's not, and they're trying to sue to keep it off the ballot. And here to explain why is Jim Barton, the attorney representing Lucha. Thank you very much for being here so much today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about this initiative. It is, yes, it does several things, but it empower local police departments to enforce federal immigration laws. But it also deals with, with business requirements, and it deals with policing of fentanyl. And for those reasons, my understanding is that you think this violates the single subject rule in the Arizona Constitution. Let's start with explaining what is the single subject rule and why you think this violates that.
Right. The single subject rule is a rule in the Constitution that says when the legislature enacts legislation, it has to embrace only one subject. And the idea is you don't put popular measures with unpopular measures and sort of sneak them through. That's called log rolling. And that's why we've always had in our Constitution the single subject rule that applies to when the legislature acts.
And why do you think this violates that? I've talked to a lot of Republicans who voted for this measure who think something needs to be done. And if you look at some polling out there, there's a lot of voters out there who think something should be done on this. And they think that these three measures, even with the fentanyl in there, all deal with immigration. Why do you think that this violates that?
Well, it violates the separate amendment or the single subject rule because they don't all deal with immigration. They don't all deal with border security. So for example, the fentanyl is a great example of how ridiculous it is. Even the Republicans that have talked about it, you'll see they'll say, well, even the fentanyl. Well, they say even the fentanyl because they know that's not in the same subject. What is fentanyl? And by the way, like farm-to-table fentanyl, like local-grown fentanyl, that seems to be okay somehow. I don't understand that. But my point is...
Farm-to-table fentanyl?
Right, farm-to-table fentanyl.
That's the first time I heard that one.
That's the okay fentanyl. That's the good fentanyl. It's ridiculously dumb, but it's also unconstitutional because, you could be a citizen and traffic fentanyl. In fact, most people who are arrested for trafficking fentanyl are U.S. citizens. So the fact that you're trying to keep a particular foreign-made fentanyl out of the country is not related to border security. That's nonsense. Other nonsense, though, is when you talk about employment, that's not related to border security. That's related to job security here at home, and that's a totally different topic than border security. Public benefits. Again, public benefits is not related to who's coming or going across the border.
And specifically, real quick, about when you start talking about that, the business stuff and public benefits, that cities have to make sure that anybody who is receiving a public benefit is in the country legally. Any employer out there hiring anybody has to make sure that, that their employee, prospective employee, has to be in the country legally, correct?
Right. Well, they have to demand documents of them to prove that they're here legally. So obviously they have all kinds of problems with enforcement that go with it. Our lawsuit, though, of course, is just by the fact that talking about employment, talking about public benefits, talking about foreign-made fentanyl, you're talking about making a state law for immigration. Those are four very different topics. They definitely are not. They don't embrace a single subject.
Okay, and real quick, let's talk a little bit about the timing of where this case is at right now. Obviously, I keep telling people, when in terms of elections and election year, it's getting late early, it seems like. We're only a couple of weeks away from early ballots dropping in the primaries. You don't have a lot of time to move on this if you want to boot this from the ballot. Where's the case stand right now? Where are you?
So the parties have agreed this is a purely legal question. So there was another measure that sort of joined in with ours. We've both provided our briefing, if you will, to the court, so the court can have a chance to review that. The interveners will have an opportunity to reply next Wednesday to respond to what we wrote, and then we'll probably have a hearing, I would say, in the first week of July. We'll have it early enough that it'll be, whoever loses, of course, is going to take it to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court will be able to rule on it before ballots are printed.
The state Supreme Court.
The state Supreme Court, yes.
And let's talk a little bit about that. What do you expect from this state Supreme Court? I mean, it is a very conservative court. I think nearly every member, maybe all of the members, I think all the members on that court has been appointed by a Republican governor. How do you expect for them to interpret the law on this one?
Well, if this was a close call, I think that would be a great point. I think when it's a close call, then you start thinking about what is the political leaning of the particular justice. This is not a close call. This absolutely does not embrace one subject. There are four very distinct subjects. So, I think the court's going to apply the law. The court has done that in the past. I mean, the court upheld minimum wage. The court let They let the Predatory Debt Protection Collection Act go to the voters. They let voter right to know go to the. I mean, I think sometimes people over-exaggerate the idea of what our Supreme Court does. When it's this way and it's a clear-cut, obvious violation, they're going to do the right thing.
All right. And when do you think this could be ruled on? When do you think it'll, by ballpark it?
I think we'll have a ruling by early to mid-August.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. We'll have to end it right there. Thank you very much for your time here today. And it's been more than a half century since Democrats controlled both sides of the state legislature. Is there a chance the power shifts in November? Our panel takes a look at some of the key races and dynamics at play in the elections this year. Next on Politics Unplugged. Welcome back to Politics Unplugged. Could the November election shift the balance of power in the state legislature? Democrats haven't had control of both the House and the Senate since the 1960s. Here to break some of this down for us, Republican consultant Marcus Dellartino and Democratic consultant Joe Wolf. Thanks for joining us again, Joe. It's been a while since we've seen you.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with you, and let's look at, you take this session as a whole. Look at this. Do you think there are opportunities now heading into the election cycle for Democrats to take control of the legislature at this point?
Absolutely, and I think this goes back to the biggest issue that I think will ultimately decide this election, in Arizona at least, and that's the abortion issue. At the end of the day, I think a lot of Republicans have exposed themselves, become very vulnerable. I think that's an issue that's very motivating. It's very emotive. So I think that alone out of this session is something that Democrats absolutely have the opportunity to ring around the necks of Republicans this fall.
And what do you think, Marcus? Let's get the Republican perspective on this. Do you think there's a good chance that the Republicans can maintain control of the legislature? Because again, I've heard this narrative over and over and over. And apologies, Joe. It's almost like Lucy with the football and Charlie Brown. It's like every couple of years, Democrats are taking control, and then boop, nope, you're just you're a seat short. So what do you think is going to happen, and what are the issues and dynamics at play heading into this election cycle?
Well, a couple things. A large part of these races are a product of the top of the ticket, and as we know, the top of the ticket is Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. So the way the state goes on the top of the ticket is going to influence a little bit how these state legislative races go, number one. Number two is these legislative districts are pretty much already locked in a majority of cases. There's about maybe 5 districts, I would argue closer to 3, that really are at play here. There are some opportunities certainly for pickups. There's a seat that, Republicans won last election cycle that probably was in a Democrat district and probably
23.
would refer back to the Democratic Party. That would tie it up. However, there's plenty of opportunities for Republicans to pick up some spots there too. So I think when you literally look at the map and you do the math, it is a lot more difficult for Democrats to take control of one of those chambers, much less both of those chambers going into November. And then third, of course, is the issues at the top of the ticket are immigration and the economy versus the abortion issue. And we're going to have to wait and see which one sort of elevates to the top.
Well, there are some extremely vulnerable Republicans, particularly Matt Gress, I think LD5.
Certainly Matt Gress is.
Right.
He is certainly vulnerable in that Central Phoenix district. So I was going to say, though, talking about, Marcus, putting immigration against abortion, we'll see which one. I think that immigration is one of those issues. How's that swaying voters? Is that winning voters? Is that moving voters one side or the other? It's different than abortion. I just was hearing some reporting recently from a podcast where they actually talked to a woman who is voting for Donald Trump, and then she's going to vote for abortion access. It seems like that issue is different than some of the other typical political issues.
Sure. Look, Arizona will never cease to surprise us in the way the voters kind of decide to split up their ticket, right? We don't get the results we've had over the last 6+ election cycles without ticket splitters. So, let's just set that aside for a second. I think, you're seeing Republicans doing everything they can to desperately reset the conversation, reset the narrative around immigration, because they know that's where voters give them the benefit of the doubt. That's a stronger issue for them. They're absolutely getting it handed to them on the abortion issue. They cannot get out of their own way here. And that is going to endanger a lot of their swing districts in the ledge, and also here in Congress, too. So Juan Ciscomani and David Schweikert should not be sitting very comfortably right now. So at the end of the day, I think you are seeing Republicans who are aware that they have a vulnerability, and they're desperately trying to pivot back to a different issue. And right now, that doesn't really seem to be working for them. The conversation, particularly in the media, has not really followed
to be
that.
fair, unfair with Democrats, particularly in Joe Biden. He is getting that issue handed to him over immigration. The numbers have been terrible for him and the large number of people coming across us. And he waits to issue these orders, to make it harder to seek asylum and stuff like that until we're several months out from an election. It's hard to not look at that and not be cynical about the motivations behind some of those moves.
Sure. I have. Again, we can set that aside. We're talking about the Arizona legislature and what these candidates are trying to do.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, Arizona voters are more than happy to reward Democrats who kind of set themselves apart, kind of cloak themselves in that, independent spirit of Arizona and go out and make their case on issues that really matter at a local level. And I think that is something that they can do, whether you can, particularly in certain districts like LD5, or you can see outperformance. That's what they have to do.
And the abortion thing has really changed the conversation in politics and dynamics for Republicans this election cycle, because now instead of talking about making abortion illegal, you're talking about Republicans are like, should it be 12 weeks? Should it be 15 weeks? And so how does a Republican who could be vulnerable on this issue, how do they navigate this new political landscape?
You pivot real quick, and you pivot to immigration and the economy. Those are the two biggest issues in the country right now, certainly the two biggest issues in the state. You watched all the air get sucked out of the room with 2060 when the legislature passed that ballot measure that you just referenced, and nobody was talking about the abortion issue. We're talking about it today on the show, but certainly not out in public. That's why Kamala Harris is coming into town this week, is so she can then reset the table back and try and frame the issue around abortion and make that the number one issue. So it's going to be a back and forth. And look, Kari Lake's numbers are up. And that's largely a product of immigration and the economy being the number one, number two issue.
Or is it? It could be. I think that Joe wants to disagree there.
Their numbers are that's a mirage. Come on, she can't get healthy, and she's not going to. Voters don't believe her or anything she says. I wouldn't buy any stock in that.
Okay.
You guys might have a big surprise coming in November.
All right, debate it. I mean, this is what this table is for, man. If you think Marcus is wrong on this,
I think Kari Lake is the least electable candidate for U.S. Senate in the country. I think there's a reason the NRSC puts out a memo but hasn't invested money. The memo they put out earlier this week said that she has a small lead. I think, again, if that was the case, if she had a 1-point lead over Ruben Gallego, right now this station would be just crawling in TV ads. Every other spot would be a TV ad for Kari Lake. I mean, at the end of the day, I think another Republican consultant made some comment about money talks, memos, do something else. And I believe that. I mean, again, like if that race was actually close, you'd be seeing a lot more spending activity like you are in Montana and Ohio and states where Republicans and the NRSC and SLF know they can pick up a seat.
So let's ask Marcus real quick, who was the winner and loser of this session this year? I mean, you look at the governor, what she laid out. Did she accomplish? Did she get a good grade for this, or do you think Republicans come out of this session feeling pretty good about themselves?
I think it was like everybody gets I don't know. I can't grade any of them. I'm in a malaise over the whole thing. My God, it's late June. I'm tired. I think we survived is the best way to put it. The budget stunk. It's a bad place to be when you have to make those sort of cuts, but education held on and actually got a little bit of money. I think everybody sort of lost perspective. Look, COVID flushed a lot of money into the system, which is why we have high inflation, by the way. But all that one-time money was...
It's a little more complicated than that. It's a little more complicated than that, sir.
So anyway, moving on. But all those road projects that we were going to get done had to be repealed back. Eventually they'll have to be reevaluated in 2 years, maybe 3 years. But, we survived. That's how I would have put this session.
Yeah, and I'd say like some of those road projects that were deferred, some of them were cut, some of them were deferred as well. I think, last year a lot of people referred to them as pork, but some of those road projects were needed, necessary, and they are going to be delayed now for a couple of years at the very least. And with that, we're going to have to end it right there. Being told that is all the time we have for this week. But be sure to join us next week for more Politics Unplugged.